The sound of tearing cloth echoed louder than it should have in the dusty silence of the street. Her voice followed, sharp with shock. "Stop." But the boy's dirty hands clung stubbornly to the front of her blouse, knuckles white with hunger and anger. He was small in frame, maybe 16, though his eyes carried the wild desperation of a man twice that age. His face was sunburned and gaunt, cheeks hollow from too many nights without supper, and his dark hair hung in greasy strands across his brow. A thin-bladed knife glinted in his other hand, raised not for a killing strike but as a threat, a warning. That he'd take what he wanted because the world had never given him anything. The woman staggered back, nearly tripping over the hitching post behind her. She was 30, though hardship had pressed its weight on her shoulders. Her once fair dress was faded by the sun, hem caked in the grit of travel, and her hands bore the raw redness of someone used to work rather than finery. Yet even in her disheveled state, she carried a dignity that seemed out of place in that rough frontier town, a woman with the bearing of someone who had known better days, who had lost much but refused to bow beneath the loss. Her bonnet had slipped from her. Head in the scuffle, auburn strands tumbling free, catching the late afternoon sun like fire. Her breath came ragged as she clutched at the boy's wrist, trying to stop his assault. "Let me go," she cried, voice breaking with both fear and fury. But the boy snarled like a cornered coyote, tugging harder, the fabric tearing down the seam. His knife hand twitched, making the watching crowd flinch. Because there was a crowd, always a crowd when violence stirred. Men leaned against wooden posts, squinting into the light. A saloon girl peeked out from behind swinging doors. No one moved. No one interfered. The sound of a dry wind sweeping down Main Street filled the silence, lifting dust devils that danced between boot heels, and then came the sound of boots, not the scuffing, half-drunken shuffle of a cowhand, nor the hurried patter of a boy running errands. This was different. Deliberate. Each step struck the earth with measured weight, heavy enough to be heard over the restless whinny of tethered horses. The boy's eyes flickered up, knife trembling just slightly, as a shadow grew long across the dirt. It stretched, swallowing both him and the woman in its breath, blotting out the sun's harsh light. The woman, breathless and trembling, turned her head slowly toward the figure stepping out from the edge of the street. For a moment her lips parted as though she meant to speak, but the words died in her throat. He was unlike the others who watched. Unlike the town that held its breath and did nothing. He was shirtless, his chest and arms broad and scarred, bronzed by the years beneath merciless western skies. Long black hair tumbled past his shoulders, catching the sunlight in silken waves, adorned with beads and feathers that marked him as a man not of the town, not of this place. Tribal jewelry gleamed against his chest, small tokens that spoke of battles fought, bloodshed, and memories carried. His gaze was steady, dark as storm clouds rolling over the mountains. The boy shifted nervously, his bravado faltering under that stare. He spat into the dust to hide his unease. "This ain't your fight," he growled, voice cracking like old timber. But the man didn't answer, not yet. He took another step forward, boots grinding into the earth, dust rising around his ankles. The townsfolk leaned forward, sensing something they had not expected, the balance of power tipping. The woman clutched the torn fabric at her chest, heart pounding in her ribs. Relief flickered across her face, though she didn't understand. Why? She didn't know this warrior, had never seen him before in her life. Yet something in his presence spoke louder than any promise could, something that said she was no longer alone. The boy tightened his grip on the knife. The crowd, still, did not move. No sheriff stepped forward. No good man drew steel to defend her. Only the warrior. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried low and certain, like the roll of thunder across a plain. "Leave her." The word hung in the air like judgment, like prophecy. For the first time, the boy hesitated. And the Old West, with all its dust and silence and watching eyes, waited to see what would COMI of IT. The boy froze, his knife trembling just inches from the woman's chest. The air in the street seemed to thicken, heavy with dust and silence. As the warrior's presence took root like an oak in a barren field, he stood tall, shirtless, the late sun etching every scar across his bronzed skin. Muscles rippled across his chest and arms, not as ornaments but as proof of years spent under merciless skies, of battles fought where only the strong returned. Long black hair, wild and unbound, whipped in the restless wind. Strands caught glimmers of copper light, framing a face carved with resolve, a face that spoke of loss and endurance. Tribal jewelry clinked faintly with each step, a necklace of carved bone, beads and small feathers that whispered of a life tied to the land and its spirits. The townsfolk had no name for him, though whispers carried one, the warrior. To some he was a savage, a ghost of the tribes who once roamed free before fences, rifles, and greed hemmed them in. To others he was a protector, a shadow who appeared where injustice struck, then vanished like smoke. To the boy, though, this was no story. This was a man, flesh and blood, whose gaze burned hotter than the sun overhead. The boy's grip on the knife faltered. His lips curled, desperate to hold on to his bravado. "This ain't your fight," he spat, though his voice cracked, betraying the crackling fear in his chest. The warrior didn't answer. Not yet. His dark eyes shifted toward the woman, who stood trembling, clutching her torn blouse tightly against herself. Her breaths came ragged, shoulders shaking, but when their eyes met hers and the warrior's, something unspoken passed between them. She did not know him, but relief welled in her gaze. Relief and something deeper, something ancient, as though some part of her soul had known a man like him must come. The wind picked up, swirling dust along the street. A lone tumbleweed rolled past, the faint rattle of its dried branches the only sound beside the boy's uneven breaths. Finally, the warrior's voice broke the silence. "Leave her." The word was low, steady, but carried the weight of thunder rolling across distant mountains. It wasn't a shout, wasn't the bark of a sheriff's order. It was something more final, a command carved from stone and shadow. The boy swallowed, his throat bobbing. The knife quivered in his grip. "Don't you tell me what to do," he snarled. "She's mine. No one else cared. No one else ever gave me nothin'." The woman flinched at his words, her eyes filling with pity even through her fear. She had heard voices like his before, the voices of children turned into wolves, voices too young to be carrying the weight of bitterness and want. The warrior took another step closer, dust puffing up beneath his boots. His hand hung loose at his side, but there was something in his stance, in the careful way his body balanced, that promised violence swifter than any rattler's strike if the boy dared to move. "You are not a man," the warrior said at last. His voice was not cruel, but it cut all the same. "A man protects, he does not take." The boy's face twisted. "Shut up, you don't know me." He jerked the knife higher, brandishing it toward the woman again as if to reclaim power through the only weapon he had left. "You don't know what it's like to be hungry, to be left in the dirt like a dog." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Still, no one stepped forward. They watched from their porches, safe behind posts and half-shut doors, content to let the warrior shoulder the moment. The woman's heart thudded in her chest. She wanted to plead with the boy, to tell him she understood, that she'd known hunger too, known the ache of nights when survival was no guarantee. But fear kept her voice lodged in her throat. The warrior's gaze did not waver. He lifted his chin slightly, eyes like fire catching hold of the boy's. "I know more than you think." Something flickered across his face, then an old memory. A scar not written on his skin but buried deeper in the marrow of his soul. For a moment, the boy hesitated, confused by the certainty in the man's words. The warrior's hand slowly rose, not toward a weapon, not toward the boy, but palm open, steady in the air. A gesture of warning, a gesture of restraint. "You have one chance," the warrior said, voice softer now but sharper than steel. "Let go." The street held its breath. The woman clutched her blouse tighter, tears gathering in her eyes. The boy's chest heaved, torn between rage and fear. His knife hovered, caught in the air like a decision not yet made, and behind them, the sun sank lower, spilling blood-red light across the town as if the heavens themselves waited for the boy's choice. The knife trembled in the boy's hand, its steel catching the last rays of the dying sun. His knuckles whitened with the effort of holding it steady. His lips curled into a sneer, but behind the bravado, sweat trickled down his temples. He barked out a laugh, sharp and ragged, a sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You think you can scare me? You're just another savage who don't belong in this town." His voice cracked halfway through, though he tried to hide it beneath anger. The street lay silent, the kind of silence that pressed down heavy on a man's chest. Somewhere, a saloon door creaked, and the faint clink of a glass echoed before being hushed again. Even the horses tethered along the hitching rails shifted uneasily, sensing the tension coiled in the air like a rattler ready to strike. The warrior didn't blink. He stood tall, dark eyes fixed on the boy as though measuring his soul. His long black hair whipped behind him in the dusty wind, beads clicking softly together. His bare chest rose and fell slow, steady like the breathing of a man who feared nothing. His silence was more dangerous than any drawn pistol. The woman pressed her back against the hitching post, clutching her torn blouse to her chest. Her auburn hair clung to her damp cheeks, her breaths coming shallow and uneven. Yet when her eyes flicked from the knife to the warrior, something shifted in her expression. She saw the boy's desperation now, saw the way his bravado cracked under the weight of the moment. He was no hardened outlaw, just a child snarling in a world that had starved him of kindness. But the boy, blinded by pride, tightened his jaw and lunged out. It was clumsy, more instinct than skill. The blade flashed toward the woman, wild and desperate. Meant to strike fear if not blood. The warrior moved, like lightning splitting the night sky. He surged forward, his body a blur of muscle and shadow. His hand shot out, seizing the boy's wrist mid-air. The knife froze, mere inches from the woman's chest. The force of the grip made the boy cry out, his bones grinding beneath the warrior's hold. The woman gasped, eyes wide, frozen in place. Boy thrashed, spitting curses through clenched teeth, his voice breaking with the shrill edge of panic. "Let me go. You don't own me." His free hand clawed at the warrior's arm, nails scraping against bronzed skin. But the warrior's grip was unyielding, carved from stone. Enough. The word rolled low from the warrior's chest, as final as the toll of a funeral bell. The crowd stirred. A few men shifted uneasily, glancing at each other as though wondering whether to step in, but none did. Not a single soul dared to interrupt. The saloon girl at the doorway clasped her hands to her mouth, eyes wide with something between horror and awe. The boy let out a guttural cry and kicked, dust flying from his worn boots. His knife hand twisted under the warrior's grip, but the man only tightened until the blade clattered free, falling to the dirt with a hollow thud. The sound rang down the empty street like a verdict. For a long moment, no one breathed. The warrior's eyes bore into the boy's face, not with cruelty, but with something deeper, something harder to define. It wasn't hatred. It was recognition. "Carry fire," the warrior said softly, his voice more solemn than angry. "But fire destroys if it has no place to burn." The boy's chest heaved, his breath sharp and ragged. Sweat dripped down his brow, and for the first time his defiance faltered. His eyes darted to the woman, who still held her blouse closed with trembling hands. She looked at him not with anger, but with a sorrow that unsettled him more than the warrior's strength. "You don't understand." The boy shouted, his voice cracking. His chin quivered, his words spilling from some deeper wound. "No one cares if I live or die." The woman's heart clenched. She wanted to speak, to reach past the knife and fury to whatever was left of the boy's humanity, but fear held her silent. The warrior did not release him. His grip was firm, his stare unwavering. "Then show them you are worth more than this." The boy's lip curled, trembling between rage and tears. His pride screamed at him to fight, but the weight of the warrior's presence pressed down like a mountain. Dust swirled around them as the sun slipped lower, staining the horizon red. The air carried the dry smell of horses, of earth baked hard by the day's heat. All of it wrapped around the moment, a cocoon of stillness before the storm yet to come. The knife lay forgotten in the dirt. The boy trembled in the warrior's grip, and the town, hushed and watchful, waited to see if the boy's defiance would break or burn brighter. The knife fell to the ground with a hollow clang, swallowed quickly by the dust. For a moment, the street was frozen in silence, as though the entire town held its breath, waiting for the next sound to split the air. The boy thrashed in the warrior's grip, his thin body twisting like a wild colt refusing to be broken. His fists hammered against the warrior's arm. His boots scuffed the dirt, and a strangled cry of rage tore from his throat. But the man held steady. His muscles flexed under the strain, bronze skin taut, veins pulsing, the strength in his grip. Unyielding as steel. "Let me go." The boy roared, voice cracking into something shrill and desperate. His eyes were wild, filled with fury, but also something rawer, something more fragile, like the fear of a child left alone in the dark. The woman gasped, hands pressed over her torn blouse, auburn hair tumbling across her flushed face. Her voice burst forth before she could stop it. "Don't kill him." The plea was sharp, urgent, startling even her. She hadn't meant to sound so desperate. She hated the boy for what he'd tried to do, hated the way his filthy hands had grabbed at her, hated the knife that had gleamed too close to her chest. Yet as she watched him struggle in the warrior's grasp, she saw not a monster but a starving, broken child, barely clinging to the edge of manhood. The warrior's eyes flicked to her, dark and unreadable. He said nothing. His attention returned to the boy, whose curses spilled into the dust. "Savage! Devil! You don't own me." "No one owns me." The crowd stirred uneasily. A few murmurs rippled down the line of onlookers. Someone whispered, "He'll break that boy's arm." Another muttered, "Maybe he should." But none stepped forward, none dared intervene. The townsfolk had grown too used to watching cruelty from a safe distance. The warrior's grip tightened, forcing the boy to his knees. The knife lay forgotten at their feet, but the boy fought on, spitting through his teeth, his thin shoulders shaking with rage. Tears glistened in the corners of his eyes, though he fought to blink them away. "Enough," the warrior said, his voice low, steady, and commanding. It was not a request. It was final, like the closing of a heavy door. The boy howled, struggling harder, his fists beating uselessly against the warrior's chest. He was no match for the man's strength. Each strike landed with all the power of desperation, but none of the weight to cause harm. Still, he fought, because to stop was to admit defeat, and defeat was all he had ever known. The woman took a trembling step forward. Her voice was softer now, but still urgent. "Please," she whispered, "he's just a boy." The warrior glanced at her again, and for the first time, a flicker of conflict passed across his stern face. He had seen boys like this before, wild, hungry, half-feral things turned cruel by the world's neglect. He knew how easily such boys became killers, how swiftly they were swallowed by the darkness that followed violence. He leaned close to the boy, his voice a growl meant for his ears alone. "This is the last time you lift your hand to a woman. Do you hear me?" The boy jerked, face twisted with defiance, but his eyes flickered with fear. His chest heaved, his breath ragged, and the warrior could feel the tremor running through his bones. The woman pressed her hand against her lips, her eyes filling with tears. She wanted to beg the warrior to let go, to spare the boy from breaking, but she was rooted in place, torn between fear and compassion. The boy's strength waned. His fists slowed, his curses weakened, until at last he sagged in the warrior's hold, gasping like a drowning man pulled from the river. Sweat streaked his dirt-stained face, tears cutting lines down his cheeks. The warrior looked down at him, studying the trembling child who only minutes before had tried to tear a woman apart. His jaw clenched. He could end it now, snap the boy's arm, leave him crippled, cast him back into the dust as punishment. Many in the town would cheer it. They would say justice was done, but the woman's voice echoed in his mind, "He's just a boy." The warrior loosened his grip, not fully, just enough for the boy to feel the shift. His voice was steady as stone when he spoke again. "Your rage is not your strength. It is your cage." The boy spat weakly at his feet, though the defiance in the gesture was half-hearted now, born more of pride than of will. His eyes flicked between the warrior and the woman, chest still heaving. The town remained silent, watching, waiting. Dust swirled around them, catching the last fire of the sun. Somewhere a crow cawed, its cry slicing through the tension. The clash was not over. It had only just begun. The boy's chest heaved as he fought against the warrior's grip, but every movement only made his weakness clearer. His knife lay buried in the dust now, glinting faintly in the last light of day. The warrior held him still, his hand clamped around the boy's thin wrist with the strength of iron. For a moment, it looked as though the street itself had gone silent, no creak of a porch board, no shuffle of boots, no rattle of wind through the eaves. Only the labored breath of the boy and the calm, measured breathing of the warrior filled the air. The woman, still holding her torn blouse together, spoke first. Her voice shook, soft but commanding in its own way. "Please," she said, "don't hurt him. He's just a boy." The warrior's gaze shifted from the knife on the ground to the trembling youth at his feet. His expression betrayed no anger, only a deep, unyielding calm. Yet his eyes held something that made even the townsfolk hesitate to breathe the quiet fire, an authority that came not from violence but from presence. The boy spat into the dust, his pride refusing to break even as his voice cracked. Don't tell me what I ain't. I ain't no boy. I'll prove it. I'll show all of you." The warrior's grip tightened just enough to make the boy wince, and then he finally spoke. His voice was low, deep, carrying the weight of a man who had seen far more than this dusty town ever would. "You prove nothing with fear, only with courage. This—" He glanced at the torn blouse of the woman and then back to the boy. "This is not courage." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Some shifted uncomfortably, others nodded faintly, as though the words had struck something they themselves had forgotten. The boy's eyes burned with defiance, though his body trembled under the warrior's hold. "You don't know me," he hissed. "You don't know what I've had to do just to eat, just to live." The warrior's expression softened slightly, though his grip remained steady. "I know hunger," he said. "I know what it means to be cold, to be hunted, to be forgotten by the world, but hunger does not excuse dishonor. You wanted to take her dignity to fill your emptiness. That is a path that leaves you emptier still." The woman drew in a shaky breath, tears welling in her eyes. She wrapped her arms tighter around herself, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and gratitude. She had expected the warrior to strike, the boy to punish him with brutal force as so many men in this town would have done. But instead, he was speaking into the boy's wounds, his words cutting deeper than fists ever could. The boy shook his head violently, his long, unwashed hair falling across his face. "You don't understand. Nobody understands. Folks laugh at me, call me nothing. I had to do something to show I'm strong." His voice cracked at the end, betraying the child that still lingered beneath all his anger. The warrior released his wrist slowly but did not move away. Instead, he knelt down so that he was level with the boy, his long hair brushing against his bare shoulders, his tribal beads and feathers swaying softly in the breeze. His voice dropped lower, but every word carried like a drumbeat. "Strength is not in what you take from the weak. It is in what you give to protect them. You think the town laughs at you now? What you tried to do tonight will make their laughter cut deeper. But if you choose a different path, if you stand for something greater, they will never laugh again. They will listen." The boy's lip trembled. For the first time, he could not meet the warrior's gaze. His eyes darted toward the woman, and shame washed over him, red rising to his face. The woman spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "He can change. I can see it." The warrior nodded once, slowly. "Change is a hard trail to walk, but every man must choose the trail he takes." The boy hung his head, his fists curling into the dust. Around them, the townsfolk stirred, whispering, their earlier hunger for blood and punishment softening into something else. A strange stillness hung in the air, as though the town itself was holding its breath to see what the boy would do. And for the first time that night, he did not fight back. The wind shifted that evening, carrying with it the faint sound of coyotes calling in the distance. The crowd that had gathered outside the saloon had begun to thin, some townsfolk retreating back to their porches, others slipping into the shadows. But the tension in the air hadn't lessened. It hung there, thick and restless, like a storm that hadn't yet broken. The warrior stood tall in the middle of the street, his chest bare beneath the fading light, the beads and feathers of his jewelry swaying with the breeze. His hand had released the boy, but his eyes, dark and unyielding, had not left him. The knife lay in the dust where it had fallen, gleaming faintly in the twilight. "Pick it up if you dare," the warrior said, his voice low and steady, carrying. Across the hushed street the boy swallowed hard, his body trembling. His pride battled with his fear, his young face twisting as if he wanted to snarl but couldn't quite muster the courage. He glanced toward the woman, who stood clutching her blouse at the edges, her eyes wide and shimmering with tears. She didn't speak, didn't move, just watched. I wasn't gonna hurt her," the boy muttered, his voice cracking, betraying the truth of his fear. The warrior's gaze hardened. "You already tried." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The boy's father, a squat, red-faced man who smelled of whiskey and bitterness, pushed through the onlookers. He staggered a little as he came forward, but his eyes burned with anger. "You got no right laying hands on my boy," he growled, his voice slurred but forceful. "He's mine to discipline, not yours." The warrior didn't flinch. He turned slowly toward the man, his long hair catching the last streaks of light, his stance calm but firm, like a mountain unmoved by a storm. "A father who teaches his son to raise a hand against women is no father," he said. The townsfolk gasped quietly at the boldness of the words. The man's face twisted redder, his fists clenching at his sides. "Careful, savage," he spat. "You don't belong here. Don't forget your place." For a moment, silence hung heavier than the heat of the dying day. The warrior's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking briefly to the woman behind him, then back to the man before him. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, but it carried the weight of thunder. "My place," he said, "is between your boy and the woman he tried to harm. If you don't see that truth, then perhaps you're the one who's lost his place." The crowd stirred again, uneasy whispers carrying along the wooden storefronts. Some nodded subtly, others looked down, unwilling to be caught siding with anyone. The father glared at the boy, who shrank under his gaze. "Go on, then," the man barked. "Pick it up. Show him you ain't weak." The boy's eyes darted between his father, the warrior, and the knife on the ground. His hand twitched, his chest rising and falling rapidly, but his feet wouldn't move. He couldn't. His heart pounded too loudly in his ears. The warrior stepped forward, closing the distance, his shadow falling over the boy. "Strength is not in the hand that strikes," he said firmly, his voice carrying like the roll of distant thunder. "It is in the hand that chooses not to." The boy's lip quivered, his knees buckling slightly as tears welled in his eyes. For the first time, he looked small, just a child, lost between the harsh demands of his father and the unforgiving world around him. The father sneered, but the woman suddenly spoke. Her voice, though shaken, cut through the tension like a blade. "Leave him be," she said, clutching her torn blouse tighter. "If you want someone to blame, blame yourself." Every head turned toward her. Her words were daring, dangerous even, but she stood her ground, her chest rising with each shaky breath. The warrior's eyes flickered with respect. The boy's father snarled, but something in the way the warrior stepped closer, calm, unshaken, powerful, made him hesitate. For the first time that night, the father faltered, his bluster weakening under the weight of the warrior's presence. The sun slipped below the horizon, and the street darkened. Torches lit along the saloon and lanterns swung on porches, but the true fire that night burned in the space between these three souls, the boy, the father, and the warrior who would not bend. The night had fallen heavy over the town, lanterns burning low along the boardwalks, their glow flickering against weathered wood. A hush lay over the place, the kind of silence that comes after a storm when no one dares disturb the stillness. Every eye in town had seen the confrontation, and every tongue was whispering of the native warrior who had stood against violence when no other man found the courage. The boy, still shaken, had been pulled back by his mother, her pale face streaked with shame and relief. The drunken father, cursing through slurred words, had finally staggered into the shadows, leaving behind the stench of whiskey and defeat. The townsfolk had gone back into their homes one by one, but not without casting glances toward the warrior. Glances that carried something between fear and reverence. Clara remained in the street, her torn blouse gathered tight at her chest, her breaths uneven. She couldn't bring herself to move, couldn't bring herself to step away from the man who had changed the course of her night, perhaps her life. Her heart hammered as she studied him, the broad chest scarred by battles long past, the way his long black hair swayed gently in the night breeze, the beads and feathers of his jewelry catching lantern light like fireflies. He was a stranger, and yet he had become her protector. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice breaking in the quiet. The warrior did not answer at once. He looked instead at the boy, retreating with his mother, then at the emptying street. When he finally turned to Clara, his voice was deep calm, carrying the weight of years. "No one should raise hand or knife against the innocent," he said. "Not boy, not man." Tears filled Clara's eyes. She had seen enough cruelty in her 30 years to know that mercy was a rare thing. "If you hadn't come—" She stopped, her words caught in her throat. She shivered despite the warm night, not from the air but from the memory of hands grasping, cloth tearing. The warrior's gaze softened, though his stance remained proud. "Fate led me here tonight," he said. "It is not always the strong who must endure. Sometimes it is the strong who must protect." Her lips trembled into something like a smile, though sorrow lingered in her eyes. "Then I owe you more. Then I can never repay." He shook his head slowly. "You owe me nothing. You will walk this town tomorrow, and they will remember you stood against shame. That is enough." For a moment, the silence stretched between them, heavy yet comforting. Clara felt the weight lift from her shoulders, though she knew the whispers of the town would come. Whispers always did. Yet she also knew she would not walk alone. She dared a step closer, her voice trembling. "Tell me your name." The warrior looked at her long and steady, as though measuring whether to trust her with it. Finally, he said, "They call me Cale." "Cale," she repeated softly, as if the syllables themselves were a promise. The night carried on, and still they stood in the dust-choked street, two souls bound not by blood nor oath, but by a moment. Of justice no one else dared deliver. Clara thought of the boy, how near he had come to darkness. She thought of her own fragility, the life she might have lost. And she thought of Cale, a man carved from stone and spirit, who had given her back her dignity when it was moments from being stripped away. At last, she lowered her head, humbled yet steady by his presence. "Perhaps fate brought you here for more than just tonight." Cale did not smile, but his eyes held a quiet warmth. "Perhaps," he said, before turning toward the open prairie, where the moonlight painted the horizon silver, and as Clara watched him go, her heart ached with something she had not felt in years. Hope that in a town full of silence, where cruelty often went unanswered, there could still be men who stood unshaken against it. The dust of his steps lingered long after he disappeared into the night, and though she returned to her home, blouse torn and body trembling, her spirit had been mended by the truth she had witnessed. A warrior's strength was not measured by fists or fury, but by the courage to protect when no one else would. And so the story of Cale spread through the town, not as a myth, not as a warning, but as a reminder. A reminder that even in the harsh lands of the Old West, where the sun scorched and the law bent beneath power, justice could still walk on two feet, bare-chested, scarred, and unyielding.